Hi, I just wanted to illustrate what it might look like to edit and proofread your textual analysis essay. I pulled up a student paper from last semester, and this person's writing on the same assignment that you guys are right now, to kind of point out some things that you might try to avoid when you are editing your own papers. So, let's get right to it. If you look at the title of this paper, it's a bit misleading because it says the 20th century, but the point is a lot more specific than that. It's about this speech by Winston Churchill, and he's talking about World War II and trying to inspire the British people to have faith that things are going to improve, because the British were not doing very well at this point during the war. So, first thing that I would want to look at is the thesis. Is it clear, and is it getting my main point across? So your audience is always going to look for your thesis at the end of your introduction. So let's look at that last sentence and see how it's working as a thesis. My analysis will be on how the speaker that had talked about this speech was very compassionate and used smart strategies by being sympathetic. My reaction as an audience member is this thesis isn't telling me a whole lot, right? For one thing, it just says the speaker, but we don't know who that speaker is yet. This person has not mentioned who gives this speech in the introduction. In fact, it doesn't really come until page 2 or 3. So that's something you want to make clear to the audience really early on in the paper. The other thing is that the writer says that the speaker used smart strategies by being sympathetic. But that's not really specifically saying what these strategies are. What does Churchill do as a speaker to try to persuade his audience? So that could probably be more specific. I think the biggest problem, though, is that we never get the writer's interpretation of this speech. What's the message that Churchill's trying to get across? That's not mentioned here, right? So, having read this paper, I figure it out, but it just takes too long to get to that point, right? So what you're going to find is there are a lot of things in this paper that are things that you should not do when you're writing your own. It's not a very good example of a textual analysis. But one problem is that the writer seems to include way too much context and background information before actually getting to analyzing the speech. So the writer includes, there's a paragraph about the Battle of Britain, which is not really that relevant to the speech itself. The writer gives a paragraph on Winston Churchill. So probably some of this information could be used because it's important to know who Churchill was, but probably just not as much as this writer is giving. Here it's talking about Churchill and his reaction to specific battles of World War II. Again, some of this information might be relevant, but really it's just taking up valuable space and preventing us from getting to the analysis part, which is really the purpose of the essay. So it's not until page 3 where we really find out what the speech is that this person is analyzing. What you have to think about when deciding to include context is the length of your essay assignment. For a 5-page paper like this, waiting until page 3 to actually start analyzing the essay is way too long. That's the main purpose of the paper, so it needs to come sooner. So my sense would be I would stick to maybe a paragraph, possibly 2 if you really have a lot of important, relevant information to give. But otherwise, try to get to that analyzing sooner rather than later when you're writing your paper. Anyway, all that being said, kind of another problem that we have is that once this writer starts actually getting to the speech, that for whatever reason, they chose to include the full text of the speech. And granted, it's not very long. I mean, it's only about a page or so long. Here's where it ends. You don't want to give the whole speech in your paper. And I suspect this was done just to try to make the paper look longer than it actually is. but instead you want to be looking at snippets of the speech and analyzing those individually. So don't do this when you're writing your own papers. So when I read the speech here, since I was given the entire thing, I came up with my own interpretation of what I think Churchill seems to be trying to do with this speech. So let me pull up a document here where I show you maybe a revised thesis that might work better for this paper. So when you're writing your thesis, you want to try to achieve 3 things. Mention who the creator is, because you're trying to really argue what you think that person is trying to do. You want to try to mention how they're persuading their audience, like what tactics are they using to do that? And maybe most importantly, what's your interpretation of this speech? What's the overall message or main idea that the creator's trying to get across with their text? So I tried to underline those parts here in this thesis that I came up with. So I said, in his speech, Churchill, and again, notice I'm using the last name here. Assume that I gave his full first name somewhere in the introduction, right? Once you give the full name once, then use the last name only. In his speech, Churchill appeals to his audience's emotions and their sense of ethics. Here I'm trying to show, here's how he's persuading his audience, by appealing to these 2 things. And then I'm given the message that I think he's trying to make. He does that to insist that if Britain works together and maintains its willingness to keep fighting through any obstacle, they can overcome any enemy. So again, this is supposed to be an inspirational speech, trying to get the British people not to give up hope that the war can turn around, right? So again, I think that is, more specific than what the writer had in this draft. So let's shift to kind of the next thing you might look at, which is how you're using quotations and citing them. So like I said, this writer chose to include the full text of the speech. You should not do that. But then they started to do what they're supposed to do, which is look at small portions of the speech and analyze those things. So in this paragraph, we are looking at a section of the speech where Churchill uses this repetition of we shall. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence. We shall defend our island. And that's like an interesting aspect of this speech. You might ask, well, why would he do that? Why use this repetition? What effect is he trying to get from doing that? So it's a good thing to analyze. But the way that it's incorporated into the paper is not so great. For one thing, and I'm going to talk about this later in the learning activity, I would avoid starting a paragraph directly with a quotation. A quote always needs to be explained and contextualized first before you bring in the actual quote. So your quotes should come in the middle of a paragraph, not the beginning. Use that beginning, that topic sentence, to kind of state the overall point that you're going to make, and then use that quote as evidence to support that idea. So couple things that I would mention. One, you always want to use double quotation marks when you're quoting somebody else's words. So this is done correctly here, but then look at the end quote. For some reason, this person used 2 single quotation marks. And again, that might seem like a small thing, like we get that this is the end of a quote, but anything that you do to potentially confuse a reader can have really negative effects on their impression of the paper, right? So that's a little thing that I would fix. This writer chose to use line numbers because the speech is pretty short. It's not even a full page long, which is fine. But I would not include the word line here. If you just give 10 through 17, the audience knows that, we're talking about line numbers here if they actually go look at this speech. Probably the bigger thing that I would address is that whenever you give a quote, you need to label it with who's actually saying it. So it's fine to use he here, but if you use he, then the citation should include Churchill. So we know that he's the one actually saying it, right? It's sort of like you have to put that name in one place or the other. If you had, in the speech, Churchill states, then you wouldn't need it here. You could just have 10 through 17, right? So let me show you a revised version of what this should look like. So I said, in the speech he states, You can use either a colon like I did here or a comma, doesn't matter. In the speech he states, "We shall fight on the seas and oceans." I didn't give the full quote here because it's kind of long just for our purposes, but again, it's this repetition of the words "we shall fight" through several lines of the paper. Notice that I fixed the double quotation marks here. Then you want to give the citation, which since this writer used he, then you want to name Churchill in the citation and give the line numbers. Notice that period always comes after the citation here, okay? So, next thing you want to think about is the organization. When you're kind of looking at different parts of an essay, it can kind of end up sounding like a bunch of disconnected or random ideas if you don't intentionally show how your paragraphs are related to each other, right? So let me give you an example from this paper. So here, this first sort of analysis paragraph is focusing on this "we shall fight" part of the speech. Again, Churchill's trying to emphasizing that no matter what happens, we're going to fight really hard. The next paragraph, again, this writer chooses to start directly with a quote, which I would not do. I would start with a topic sentence first. But this paragraph is focusing on, again, this "we shall" repetition, but in a different way, where Churchill also states, "We shall never surrender." So it's like, not only will we keep fighting, but even when that fighting's not going well, we're not going to surrender or give up either, right? The way that it's written, these two ideas don't really seem that connected, but they are. It's sort of like this "we shall never surrender" is sort of an extension of that earlier message, "we shall fight," right? So an easy thing you could do to show that connection and make it more clear is to use a transition. And I'm going to talk about that later in the learning activity. But a transition is sort of like a connector word or phrase that shows the relationship between two ideas, or in this case, two paragraphs. So something I might do in that second paragraph is use the transition "furthermore." So again, I'm kind of use "furthermore" when you're extending an idea, right? So the previous paragraph's talking about fighting, but this paragraph's about not giving up, right? Furthermore, Churchill believes that even if troops are fighting unsuccessfully, they will never give up. So it's like not only the stuff in the previous paragraph, but even further, they're never going to surrender, right? So adding some transitions to your paper is an easy way to like show the relationships between paragraphs, show that connection. So final thing to look for, things like grammar, wordiness, all of those sorts of things, right? So I just chose to look at the very first couple of sentences of the paper because already there are some problems. There's some word issues and kind of more information than we really need, right? So for one thing, the writer says in the 1940 to 1945s. That sounds odd. You could just as easily say in the 1940s. That's an easy way to fix that. But the bigger problem is that we have a sentence fragment going on here in the second sentence. The first sentence is fine. In the 1940s, many major events occurred. But then this is just an extension of that first sentence, right? Events like blah, 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 right? So the easiest way to fix this is to connect this fragment. And again, I'm going to talk about fragments later in this learning activity. But this thing that's not really a sentence, just connect it to this first sentence that can stand by itself, right? So here's a revised version of those first couple of sentences. In the 1940s, many major events occurred as a result of World War II. I chose to connect it with a comma instead of a period. Events like Pearl Harbor, Anne Frank's concealment from the Nazis, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Battle of Britain, and the creation of the first computer. So again, just by making a couple of small changes and eliminating a lot of unnecessary stuff, this idea hopefully sounds a lot more clear now, right? Notice that when you're talking about a year or something like that, or a decade, you don't need an apostrophe like that writer used in the original. But again, I kind of connected them all to World War II, which was not done in the original draft, right? So again, these are all things to look at as you are editing and proofreading. So hopefully this helps you as you go through your papers. Bye.